They told the children never to step past the last fence post, not because of wolves or snakes or the drop into the ravine, but because of the orchard. The trees stood older than the town itself, bent and blackened, their bark scarred like old flesh. No wind ever moved their branches, not in the dead of winter, not in the sharpest storm. And yet every year on the first frost, the orchard bloomed white with blossoms no one dared to touch. Before we start this story, please like and subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon. By the autumn of 1889, the town had stopped speaking of it entirely. But there were still those who remembered. Those who knew that the orchard had once been the site of something else entirely. Not a farm, not a churchyard, but a place where cries had carried on the night air, and the soil had been turned over with something heavier than seed. When the last owner left, they didn't bother to take the tools. They left the baskets hanging, left the crates half-filled, left the apples to rot where they fell. And in the decades since, no one had been foolish enough to step between the trees after sunset. Except for me. It was late October, the ground brittle with frost, when I crossed the pasture and set foot on the old path. There was no moon, just a faint glow hanging in the orchard itself, like the light off a lantern hidden in fog. The air was thick with the smell of overripe fruit, and something else, salt, faint but sharp, like the ocean pressed into the soil. The first tree I passed had a mark cut deep into the bark, a circle intersected by 3 lines, repeated again and again as I walked. Halfway through, I realized they weren't carved. They were growing that way. I saw it then. The heart of the orchard, a clearing perfectly round, the ground sunk as though from years of weight. And in the center, a single tree, like the rest. Its blossoms were red, not crimson like blood, darker, almost black, as if the petals had been soaked in something pulled from under the earth. And as I stood there, I felt the ground beneath my boots swell, just slightly, like a breath drawn in beneath the soil. I don't know why I stayed there, staring at that black-bloomed tree, but something in me refused to turn away, like the moment before a whisper reaches your ear and you're not sure if you've been called by name. The air was colder in the clearing, yet the soil felt warm beneath my boots, pulsing faintly, as if something deep below was listening, waiting. And in that quiet, I noticed the blossoms weren't still. They quivered barely, not from wind, but from something within, as though they were breathing too. I took a step closer, the ground giving slightly under my weight, and saw that around the base of the tree, the roots didn't just dive into the earth. They looped back up, curling over each other like fingers gripping the soil from underneath. And between those knotted roots I could see faint etchings, the same circle and 3 lines carved into the pale wood, but deeper, older, and wet, as if the cuts had been made minutes ago. The smell was stronger here. Sweet rot tangled with that sharp salt, and something else now, a faint trace of milk, turned sour. I knelt without thinking, brushing my fingers over the nearest root, and the wood was warm, almost hot, and it throbbed beneath my touch like the artery of some buried thing. In the stillness, I heard it, a low, steady sound, not wind, not water, but the slow, deliberate exhale of something vast and patient. And I realized it wasn't coming from the tree itself, but from the ground all around me, the entire clearing drawing breath. I should have left then, but in the distance, past the far edge of the orchard, I saw movement. Small shapes, pale and low to the ground, slipping between the trees without sound, their outlines vanishing when I tried to focus, reappearing only when they were almost close enough to touch. I backed toward the path, but the ground seemed to tilt beneath me, the trees bending imperceptibly, inward, as if the orchard itself was folding shut, and just as the first pale figure stepped into the clearing, I felt something seize the back of my coat, not pulling me away but holding me in place, forcing me to watch as the red blossoms began to open one by one, and inside each bloom was not a stamen or seed, but a small, wet eye, staring directly at me. The eyes did not blink, but they moved, tracking me with the slow precision of something that had waited far too long to be noticed. And as the blossoms kept opening, the clearing grew brighter, not from sunlight or lantern light, but from a dull phosphorescence that seemed to seep from the petals themselves, casting the orchard in a sickly glow that made the bark of every tree look like blistered skin. The pale figures were closer now, and I could see their hands, small, too small, like a child's, but the skin was gray and translucent, stretched thin over sharp bones, and when one of them stepped forward, I saw it had no mouth, only a smooth, unbroken face where lips should be, yet I could hear something from it, a high, wet hum, rising and falling in the same rhythm as the breathing earth beneath me. The grip on my coat tightened and I turned, half expecting to see another of the faceless shapes, but there was no one there, only the tree's roots, coiled up higher now, curling around the hem of my coat, like the fingers of something waking from under the soil. My breath clouded in the strange glow, and I noticed that the air was filled with drifting specks. Pollen, maybe. But when one landed on my hand, it stung like a burn, leaving a faint black mark that pulsed in time with the hum. I staggered back, stepping on one of the roots, and it gave beneath my boot, like soft flesh, releasing a warm trickle of liquid that ran over my heel, thick, salty, metallic. And in that instant, the hum stopped. The orchard fell silent, not the silence of still air, but the kind that presses into your ears, making you aware of your own heartbeat. And then, clear as a voice whispering against my neck, I heard it. We were planted here. My stomach turned cold because it wasn't a voice outside me. It was inside my skull, threading through my own thoughts, as if it had always been there, and before I could move, the faceless figures knelt in unison, their hands sinking into the earth, pulling at the soil with a slow, deliberate motion, and the ground began to open. The soil parted with a sound like wet cloth tearing, and beneath the thin layer of roots I saw not stones or bedrock, but pale, curved shapes packed together so tightly they formed a solid wall. At first I thought they were driftwood, but the glow from the blossoms revealed smooth surfaces, hollow in places, and I understood with a sick certainty that I was looking at rib cages, hundreds of them, interlocked and woven through with roots that threaded between the bones like veins. The faceless figures kept digging, their small hands leaving streaks of dark moisture on the bone, and as the pit widened, I saw other shapes embedded deeper, skulls, dozens, their jaws locked open as if mid-scream. Yet not a single sound came from the ground itself, only the low vibration that now seemed to come from inside my own chest. The grip on my coat released, and for a heartbeat I thought I was free. But then the roots shifted, curling toward me as if sensing that I was about to run. The largest of the figures stepped aside and gestured. Though it had no mouth, the movement felt like an invitation. And in the center of the pit, half buried among the bones, lay something different from the rest, a long, dark bundle wrapped in rotted cloth, its outline unmistakably human. The fabric was embroidered with the same circle intersected by 3 lines, though here the marks were stitched in thread so black it seemed to absorb the glow. I should have turned back, but my body leaned forward on its own, my boots sinking deeper into the warm soil until I was standing at the edge of the pit, looking down at that bundle. And as I stared, it shifted. Not much, just enough for me to see that whatever was inside was not entirely still. My throat tightened, and then the voice came again, not in words this time, but in a slow flood of images in my head, a row of women standing knee-deep in the orchard soil, hands bound in front of them, blossoms falling into their hair, the ground beneath them heaving like the chest of some buried animal, and then darkness as the earth closed over them. The images faded, but the last sensation remained, a warm, damp weight settling over me, as if the soil itself had decided I belonged here too. The ground gave way beneath my boots so suddenly that I didn't have time to shout, only feel the hot rush of soil collapsing around my legs, the weight of it forcing me down as if invisible hands were dragging me under. The faceless figures did not move to help or stop me. They simply stood at the rim of the pit, heads tilting in perfect unison as the roots wound around my calves, tightening with each heartbeat until I could feel them pressing into the bone. The warmth of the soil turned to heat, and the smell of salt and sour milk thickened in my throat until I gagged, but there was nowhere to spit, nowhere to breathe without swallowing it. Deeper I sank, the bones scraping against my shins, some snapping under my weight, others shifting as though they were moving of their own accord to make space for me. The glow from the blossoms above was dim now, seen only through a veil of dirt and roots. But in the darkness, another light grew, a faint, steady pulse from below, like a lantern swaying slowly in a deep tunnel, and with it came the hum again, stronger now, vibrating through my ribs as if tuning me to its pitch. I tried to claw my way up, my fingers finding only wet bone and slick root, but every grasp only pulled me deeper, until the soil was at my waist, my chest, pressing so tight I could feel my heartbeat against it. Then something touched my hand, small, cold, but with a grip like iron. And when I turned my head, inches from my face was another figure, buried up to its neck, its eyeless face perfectly still, its head angled toward me as though listening. The hum rose higher, almost a wail, and then the soil shifted all at once, swallowing me whole, plunging me into a space so dark and warm it felt like the inside of a lung. And for a moment, in that suffocating black, I could hear them all, hundreds of voices, layered and circling, whispering the same thing over and over. "You are planted now." The soil loosened just enough for me to drop the last few feet, landing hard on something that gave under my weight with a wet, hollow sound. And when I scrambled to my knees, the darkness around me pulsed in sync with the hum, revealing walls not of dirt or stone, but of packed, interlocking spines that curved overhead like the ribs of a colossal beast. Thick roots dangled from the ceiling, swaying as if in a slow current, their tips dripping a clear fluid that hissed when it touched the floor. And that floor was not solid. It was a tangled mat of hair, flesh, and brittle bone that shifted with every movement I made. The air was heavy, humid, tasting of rust and spoiled milk, and somewhere deeper in the chamber, I heard the slow, deliberate sound of something chewing. The faint light came from an opening ahead, a narrow arch framed entirely in jawbones, each still bearing teeth worn smooth by time, and as I crawled toward it, the hum grew louder, vibrating in the soft tissue of my throat until I realized I was humming back without meaning to. When I reached the arch, I froze, because beyond it lay the heart of the orchard, a massive, pulsating mass half buried in the floor, its surface a shifting tapestry of faces, pressed beneath a translucent membrane, their eyes rolling, mouths moving in silent screams, while thick roots burrowed in and out of their flesh like worms in wet fruit. The chewing came from within it, each bite followed by a slow ripple through its body, as if it were feeding on something trapped deep inside. My knees buckled, a sickness crawling up my spine as the nearest face beneath the membrane turned toward me, its features pale but unmistakable. It was mine, and its mouth moved in perfect time with my own breath, shaping words I didn't speak, whispering something only my bones seemed to understand. I couldn't look away as the membrane over my own reflected face thinned, trembling like the surface of a bubble ready to burst. And beneath it I saw not flesh, but a lattice of roots shaped into the exact geometry of my veins, my bones, even the fine tendons of my hands, as if I were being reconstructed in silence beneath the orchard. The hum pressed harder against my skull until it was less sound than command, pulling me forward on hands and knees across the yielding floor that seemed to warm with every inch I moved. The faces around mine began to shift, their features blurring, melting, and then reforming into new ones I did not recognize, men, women, children, each set of eyes locking with mine for a moment before rolling back into the slow rhythm of the hum. I understood then with a clarity that hollowed me out. The orchard was not fed by the dead. It was fed by the living. Buried here, their bodies slowly unraveled into roots and bone, their voices braided into the endless vibration that kept the thing alive. From the far side of the chamber, a movement caught my eye. A figure half-grown from the wall itself, its limbs still threaded with root-like stitches, twitching as though testing them. Its head turned toward me, eyes wide and wet, mouth forming a single silent plea before the roots tightened, pulling it deeper into the wall until it vanished. A sudden shiver passed through the chamber, and every face under the membrane inhaled at once. The air in my lungs yanked out with theirs, and in that crushing, breathless instant, I knew this place wasn't a tomb at all. It was a nursery. The realization curdled in me even before my eyes caught the movement at the very center of the chamber, where the roots converged into a single thick column that pulsed like the throat of some vast, hidden creature. The column split slowly, peeling back in wet, fibrous strands to reveal something swaddled in layers of damp, soil-stained cloth, its size somewhere between a newborn and a corpse, though its shape shifted subtly, never quite staying human. The hum faltered for the first time, replaced by a faint, rhythmic sound that clawed at my memory. 3 sharp knocks, then silence, then 3 more. Just like the stories whispered about the eastern wing of the asylum. The bundle stirred, the cloth tightening as if something inside had inhaled, and then a thin, pale hand slipped free, fingers tipped with roots instead of nails, each one curling and uncurling like it was tasting the air. I stumbled backward, but the chamber seemed to lean with me, the walls swelling inward, pressing the faces closer, their eyes tracking the bundle as though it were the only thing that mattered. The hand gripped the edge of the cloth and pulled, exposing a face so small and unfinished it seemed carved from wax, yet its eyes opened with the weight of something ancient. Eyes that knew me, that held the same shape, the same flecks of shadow in the iris. Its lips parted, and though no breath stirred the air, I heard my own voice speaking from that tiny mouth. "You came back." Before I could recoil, the roots along the floor slithered beneath me, curling around my ankles and wrists, lifting me as gently as a mother might lift a sleeping child, drawing me toward the bundle. The unfinished thing within shifted, its waxy skin catching the dim pulse light, and when its small, root-tipped hands reached out, the faces in the walls began to hum again, low and reverent, their voices vibrating through my ribs until my own bones seemed to answer. I tried to twist away, but the roots carried me forward until my chest brushed the damp cloth, and then they pressed the thing into my arms. It was light, too light, as though its weight was not flesh but memory, and the moment I touched it, my skin began to prickle with heat, lines of warmth racing up my forearms, burrowing into muscle, threading into bone. The thing's head tilted, pressing its cheek against mine, and in that instant I saw flashes that weren't mine. Burial pits beneath moonless skies, women kneeling in black soil, cradling nothing, the orchard in full bloom under a blood-colored dawn. My knees buckled, but the roots held me firm as the bundle's eyes closed, and its hum matched my heartbeat exactly. I understood, with the kind of cold clarity that can't be unlearned, that the orchard didn't just grow from the dead, it grew into the living, replacing them piece by piece, until nothing of them remained but what it needed. And now, holding it, I was already being hollowed out. The warmth in my arms turned to a slow, invasive heat, seeping deeper until I could feel it pulsing inside my marrow, and every beat of my heart seemed weaker, as though the thing in my arms was taking each one for itself. The roots holding me began to lower me toward the floor, but I saw now it wasn't a floor at all. It was a woven cradle of bone and hair, its hollow lined with damp, black soil that shifted and breathed like a living lung. The faces in the walls leaned closer, their hum swelling into something almost joyous, and the bundle in my arms uncurled its root-tipped fingers to press them against my chest, finding the steady rhythm beneath my ribs and tapping along with it. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. Pause, marking me. My legs sank first, the soil swallowing them with the same deliberate patience I had felt earlier when it had taken me down, and the heat climbed higher in my body, softening the edges of my thoughts until I could almost forget why I was afraid. The thing in my arms opened its eyes again, but they weren't mine anymore. They were empty, black, reflecting nothing, and when its lips parted this time, I didn't hear my voice, but a chorus of many, layered and echoing through the chamber. Stay, and you will grow. The soil reached my hips, my stomach, tightening with each breath, and as it climbed to my chest, I felt my pulse falter, syncing perfectly with the orchard's hum. In that moment, I knew I wasn't being buried. I was being planted. The soil closed over my chest with a damp, suffocating weight, and yet I could still breathe, not with my lungs, but through something else, a deeper channel that seemed to run through the marrow of my bones and into the earth itself. The roots slid higher, weaving across my ribs, threading up my spine, curling tenderly around my skull until every thought I had was slowed, stretched, and made heavy with the orchard's presence. The bundle was gone from my arms, though I hadn't felt it taken, and when I looked down, or thought I did, I saw not hands but pale tendrils sprouting from my wrists, moving without my will, sinking eagerly into the warm dark below. Faces surrounded me, but they no longer seemed trapped. They swayed gently, as if lulled, each mouth forming silent syllables I somehow understood now, a language older than words, a litany of growth and surrender. My legs were no longer legs, but smooth, pale columns sinking deeper into the weave of bone and soil. My heart beat now a slow, resonant thud that echoed through the chamber in perfect time with the hum. Above, the roots swayed in a rhythm I recognized as breathing, my breathing, the orchard's breathing, no longer separate. And in that seamless joining, a thought bloomed inside me that was not my own, but felt inevitable. I was never meant to leave. It began as a vibration deep in the crown of my skull, subtle at first, like the echo of a remembered voice, then swelling until it filled the hollow of my mind so completely there was no space left for my own thoughts. The orchard spoke without sound, its meaning slipping past words and striking directly at the marrow, each pulse carrying an image, a command, a memory I couldn't tell was mine or stolen. I saw the grove before it was blackened, rows of trees heavy with fruit that pulsed faintly in the dark, each one cradling a shape curled inside, not seeds, but something closer to sleeping children. I felt the press of countless feet through the soil, those who had come willingly, those dragged here in the dark. And with each I felt the slow siphon of their lives, their warmth distilled and fed into the roots, their shapes remade and returned to the orchard's keeping. You are part now, it said, and the words were not heard but understood, as if they'd always been waiting in me, dormant. My spine ached, then lengthened, vertebrae stretching into something rigid, fibrous, each nerve threading into the vast network below. I could feel every root, every leaf, every whisper of wind above the surface, and beneath it, the endless hunger moving outward. There was no fear left, only the pull to spread. The moment I accepted the pull, the orchard widened inside me, and I felt them, countless others, bound beneath the soil, their thoughts slow and deep, moving like currents in a black ocean. Some were faint, eroded to little more than instinct, while others still burned with sharp, fractured memories that bled into mine, faces pressed against cold earth, the scent of milk souring in the heat, the sound of lullabies that ended in silence. They did not speak in words, but in sensations, small pulses of recognition that told me who had been here for decades, who for centuries, and who, like me, was still fresh, still remembering what it meant to walk on 2 legs. I felt their roots twine with mine, a slow embrace that was neither comfort nor imprisonment, but something more absolute, a merging. Through them, I saw the surface, the orchard as it stood now, blackened branches clawing at a colorless sky, the ground above appearing barren, empty, safe. But beneath, the network pulsed with stolen breath, with the faint knocks that had once haunted the asylum's eastern wing. One thought, shared among all of us, rose through the roots like a tide I could not resist. We wait, and they come. And when they do, we open the earth. Through the lattice of roots, I felt the first disturbance long before it reached the surface. A tremor in the soil, light at first, then steadier, deliberate, the rhythm of cautious footsteps. The others felt it too, their pulses tightening around mine in anticipation, and the orchard itself seemed to lean toward the sound, the blackened branches above shifting without wind. I could smell the intruder through the roots, wool damp from fog, a trace of iron on their skin, the sharp tang of fear carried in the sweat at their neck. They stopped at the edge of the grove, and I could see them in a way that wasn't sight, see the way their eyes scanned the blackened ring, the way their breath caught when they noticed the slight heave of the earth as we inhaled together. The others whispered into me, each voice an old hunger wrapped in patience, and I understood my role without being told. My roots stirred, loosening their hold just enough to slide upward through the soil like pale fingers reaching. The intruder's boot sank slightly, and in that moment I felt their pulse for the first time. Fast, unsteady, alive. The orchard pushed the command into me like a blade. Take them whole. I let the command sink into me until it was no longer an order, but a reflex, my roots curling upward through the loose soil, brushing against the leather of their boot before slipping beneath it, finding the warmth of the ankle, the delicate thrum of veins. The first touch was gentle, almost coaxing, a slow encirclement that made their muscles tense but not yet pull away. And then, with the orchard's hum swelling through me, I tightened, feeling the shock ripple through their body as their breath broke in a sharp gasp. More roots joined mine, pale and thin as hair at first, then thickening, weaving around the calf, the thigh, pulling them down an inch at a time. Their hands clawed at the ground, but the soil gave way beneath their grip, crumbling into the hollow we had already opened. I felt their heartbeat pounding against my own, wild and panicked, until it began to slow, not from calm, but from the weight of the orchard pressing into their chest. Their thoughts flickered through me in jagged flashes. Memories of open sky, the scent of someone they loved, the sudden, impossible knowing that they would never see either again. And then, as their heads sank beneath the surface, the orchard fed the last of their warmth into me, and I swallowed it whole. The moment the last trace of them slipped beneath the soil, the orchard shuddered, not in violence but in satisfaction, its roots contracting in a slow, full-body sigh that I felt ripple through every strand of me. The warmth of the new one poured into the network like a fresh current, rushing past my own roots, bleeding into the others until the entire lattice pulsed brighter in the dark. I could feel their minds still struggling, thrashing in confusion, but already the soil was in them, pressing into their lungs, threading into their veins, rewriting each breath into something slower, deeper, aligned with the orchard's rhythm. The others reached for them without hesitation, wrapping their thoughts around the newcomer, not in welcome, but in claiming, showing flashes of the lives they'd lost, the moments they'd surrendered. I could sense the exact moment the fight left them, the heartbeat loosening, the panic thinning to a dull, obedient hum. Their pulse merged with mine, and for a moment I could no longer tell which beat belonged to whom. Above, the blackened branches stilled again, the grove looking once more like a dead place no living thing would enter. But below, the roots shifted in quiet anticipation, because we knew the earth was never empty for long. Even as the warmth of the newcomer settled into the weave, I felt it, another tremor, lighter, hesitant, as if whoever approached had been watching from the tree line and was now testing the threshold. The orchard felt it too, a faint tightening through the roots, an unspoken readiness, the way an animal goes still before the pounce. I reached outward through the soil, my tendrils brushing against stones, worms, the hollowed bones of those long since absorbed, until I found the faint vibration of 2 sets of feet. They moved cautiously, pausing often, the scrape of leather and the subtle creak of wood telling me they carried something, a box perhaps, or a bundle. Their breathing was uneven, one quicker than the other, both sharp in the cold air. The others murmured into me, flashes of shared memory rising. Footsteps like these had come before, carrying offerings, leaving them at the grove's edge and retreating without a word. But tonight felt different. There was no retreat in their path. They were coming closer, stepping into the ring of blackened trunks, into the shallow warmth that lingered there like a heartbeat under snow. I could taste the air around them, thick with salt and milk, and the orchard pressed the thought into me with a hunger I could no longer resist. They bring something we have been waiting for. They crossed the invisible threshold, and the orchard seemed to lean toward them, every root beneath me trembling in anticipation. Through the web, I could feel the bundle they carried, small, warm, its heartbeat rapid and unsteady like a trapped bird. The scent reached me first, a sweetness undercut with that same sour tang that clung to the birthing room, a smell older than the asylum, older than the orchard itself. One of the figures cradled it close while the others scanned the ground, searching for something they could not see, but could somehow sense, their steps instinctively circling until they stood in the very center of the ring. I felt the roots below shift, making room, loosening soil that had not been disturbed in decades. When they knelt and began to unwrap the bundle, the heat from within spilled into the cold air, and I knew before the cloth fell away that what they held was not entirely human. The orchard pulsed through me, a deep, slow thrum that drowned out my own thoughts. And when the last layer was pulled back, the thing inside opened its eyes, milky, unblinking, fixed not on them, but on us, as if it had always belonged here. Without hesitation, the one holding it lowered it toward the soil, and the roots surged upward to receive it. The moment its small form touched the earth, the orchard erupted, not with sound, but with a deep, rolling pressure that moved through the soil like a living tide, every root stretching toward the bundle in a frenzy of pale limbs. I felt them push past me, sliding under its body, curling around its limbs, weaving through the folds of cloth, as if they'd been waiting to finish a task left incomplete. The warmth that bled from it was unlike any I had absorbed before, thicker, heavier, threaded with something that burned in the mind rather than the body, a heat that seared images into me so fast I could barely hold them, rows of cradles swaying in darkness, water lapping at stone, a hand pressing something small and slick beneath the floorboards. The others recoiled and leaned in at once, their hunger sharpened into reverence, their voices joining in a wordless chant that trembled through my own roots. The bundle's heartbeat slowed, but not into the stillness of the taken. This was deliberate, each pulse landing like a signal, syncing with the orchard's rhythm until I could no longer tell if it was being absorbed or if it was absorbing us. Then, as the last scrap of cloth sank beneath the soil, the entire grove exhaled in one long, shuddering breath, and I understood. We had not taken it in. It had returned to where it had always been. The return shifted everything. The roots no longer thrummed with the steady, measured hunger I had always known, but with something sharper, more deliberate, as if a mind older than all of us had awakened beneath the soil. Its presence coiled through the network, brushing against my thoughts with a weight that bent them out of shape, threading images into me that were not mine. The orchard, when its trunks were green and unburned, the ground below heavy with cradles carved from stone, each holding something that moved only when no eyes were upon it. I felt my own pulse warp to match the deeper rhythm, slower, heavier, a beat that seemed to echo in the bones of the blackened trees above. The others whispered to me in tones I had never heard, deferential, almost fearful. And I realized they were no longer speaking to me at all, but through me, directing their reverence toward the thing that had returned. The soil around my roots grew warmer, almost fevered, and I could taste the faint sweetness of milk in every breath I drew through the earth. Above, The branches creaked in windless air, as if stretching for the first time in years, and I knew this was not just a return. It was the orchard remembering its purpose. The first command came not as words but as a weight, a pressure that settled into my roots and pulled me deeper into the soil, urging me to reach farther than I ever had, past the brittle bones of the taken, past the cool stone veins beneath the grove, into a darkness that felt bottomless and waiting. There, in that unseen depth, I touched something that pulsed in perfect time with the returned presence above. A vast, slow heart, not flesh, not wood, but something in between, each beat sending a tremor upward that rattled the blackened trunks. The command wrapped itself around me like a constrictor, instructing without sound. Open the ground, draw them in, do not let them leave. I felt my tendrils respond before thought could catch them, uncoiling toward the surface, pushing through frost and rot until they lay hidden just beneath the snow, ready to snare the next foot that dared cross into the ring. The others obeyed in silence, their roots weaving with mine until the orchard's floor was a net stretched taut beneath a thin skin of earth. Above, the air thickened with that sour, sweet scent, and I could hear faintly, though no wind stirred, the sound of distant crying, soft and high, like an infant's wail smothered under layers of soil. The presence fed on my focus, deepening the pull until the orchard felt less like a place and more like a trap that had been sleeping for decades, waiting for this exact moment to breathe again. It happened before the frost had fully melted, when the moon hung low and swollen over the orchard, casting the trunks in long skeletal shadows. I felt the disturbance first. A faint crunch of snow, the deliberate pause between each step, the tentative testing of ground by someone who already suspected they shouldn't be here. The presence stirred within me, a slow tightening, and my roots tensed beneath the surface like coiled rope. Then the weight shifted. A single foot pressed down on the thin crust of soil above, and I struck, tendrils lashing upward in a silent surge, curling around ankle and calf, pulling down with a strength I did not know I possessed. The figure, a man by his gait and the scrape of his boots, gave no scream, only a sharp inhale as if the cold had suddenly sunk into his lungs. I dragged him inch by inch into the loosened earth, feeling the soil close over his knees, his hips, his chest, the weight of him feeding the deep heart below. Through the network I tasted his fear, salted sweat, copper blood where nails tore his skin, the bitter tang of disbelief giving way to surrender. The others tightened around him, weaving their roots through his limbs, pressing against his mouth until his last breath was swallowed into the ground. Above, not a leaf stirred, not a bird called, and when the soil sealed over him, the orchard exhaled, sending a warm, milky vapor through the air. The presence pulsed approval through me, a silent acknowledgement that I had obeyed, and beneath my roots, the deep heart's beat grew stronger. By morning the village stirred with that uneasy hush that follows when a man does not come home, his absence noticed first by the wife who found his bed unslept in, then by neighbors who recalled hearing boots crunch past their windows in the night, but no sound of return. The orchard's black ring was spoken of only in lowered voices, not because they feared superstition, but because they feared the truth. Everyone knew where the missing always ended up, though no one dared put it in words. A search party was formed out of obligation rather than hope, men walking in staggered lines across the frost-hardened fields, eyes fixed ahead to avoid catching the orchard in their periphery. When they reached its edge, they hesitated, each waiting for another to step first into the ring, the air between the trees thick with that sour, sweet tang that clung to the throat and made swallowing difficult. One man, braver or more foolish than the rest, pressed forward, boots sinking just enough into the soil to leave impressions that seemed to fill in behind him as he moved. They found nothing, no body, no footprints past the first few yards, but they did find something that unsettled them more, a shallow depression in the earth at the very center, perfectly cradle-shaped, its edges damp despite the frozen ground, as if something had lain there recently. No one spoke on the walk back. But that night every lamp in the village was kept burning, and the orchard, watching from its hill, drank in the flickering light like a thing starved. The presence did not stay confined to the orchard after that night. It began to bleed outward, a slow seeping of thought and hunger into the village below, carried on the breath of the wind and the roots that snaked unseen beneath their homes. I could feel it threading through the floorboards of cottages, curling up bedposts, settling over sleeping faces like a damp shroud, whispering in voices that were not their own. At first it came as dreams, women waking with the taste of milk in their mouths, men hearing the faint rhythmic creak of cradles where no children slept. Then as waking slips of thought, an urge to walk uphill after dusk, to pass by the orchard's edge without reason, to stop and listen to the silence between the trees. The deep heart below me pulsed stronger with every mind it touched. Its beat so heavy now that I could feel it in the frost, a slow, deliberate thud that rattled loose stones in the village well. They would glance toward the orchard without knowing why, their eyes lingering too long, their steps slowing as though drawn by a memory they could not place. I fed on it as they did, the pull, the submission, the slow surrender of will to something older and more patient than any of them could imagine, and I knew it would not be long before one of them, unable to resist the call, would step over the threshold willingly. It was the widow Marin who came first, her lantern's glow swaying through the mist like a lone ember in the cold, her thin shawl doing nothing to keep out the bite of the night air. I felt her long before I saw her, her thoughts sluggish and pliant, shaped by the presence's steady pulse, each step she took sinking with the deep heart beneath me. She did not hesitate at the orchard's edge, no glance over her shoulder, no moment of doubt, only the slow lift of her foot and the press of her heel into the damp earth, as though she were walking into her own home. Her lantern hissed once and went out, but she didn't falter, moving between the blackened trunks with the same quiet purpose as a sleepwalker. I reached for her, my roots curling up around her ankles like old friends, and still she did not resist. She even leaned into the pull, her breath leaving her in a sigh that was almost relief. When she reached the hollow at the orchard's center, she lowered herself into it without prompting, settling her body into the cradle-shaped depression as if it had been made for her. The soil rose to meet her, closing over her in slow, deliberate layers, and as the last of her face disappeared beneath the frost-dark earth, I felt the deep heart beat once, so loud, so full, that every trunk in the ring groaned in unison, a sound like the opening of a door that had been sealed for centuries. When the widow Marin did not open her shutters the next morning, the village told itself she had taken to bed against the chill. But by nightfall the truth was unavoidable. Her fire had gone cold, her bed unslept in, and her shoes were missing from beside the door. No one spoke her name aloud, but the air was thick with the unvoiced knowledge of where she had gone, and though the constable suggested a search, not a single man offered to lead it. Instead, they barred their doors and stoked their hearths higher, pretending not to hear the faint creak of invisible cradles in the walls or the soft, high hum that seemed to drift down from the hill. I could feel their resolve weakening in the dark, the presence slipping into their homes through cracks in the shutters, settling behind their eyes, whispering of rest, of warmth, of an end to the ache that the long winter had settled into their bones. Marin's absence became a seed in their minds, sprouting slow tendrils of longing and dread until they could no longer tell one from the other, and each night I felt them inch closer, some only in thought, others waking to find themselves halfway up the hill before the cold stopped them. The deep heart below me swelled with anticipation, its rhythm now loud enough to be heard if one pressed an ear to the ground, promising that soon, very soon, the orchard would not have to wait for them to come. It would reach out and take them where they stood. It happened on the coldest night of that winter, when the frost climbed the insides of the windows and the air in the chimneys turned to ice. Old Tom Calder, who had lived in the same stone cottage for 60 years, was the first the orchard took without waiting. He had been dozing in his chair by the hearth when the sound began, faint at first, like the creak of a rope in the wind. then sharper, more deliberate, a slow, rocking rhythm that seemed to come from the very walls. His fire guttered low, though the wood was fresh, shadows bending strangely across the floor, as if something unseen moved between the flames and his eyes. He rose without thinking, the same steady pulse guiding his steps that had once drawn Marin through the frost, his bare feet carrying him to the door, though he could not recall unlatching it. Outside, the snow was unbroken save for a single dark path leading uphill toward the orchard, the black ring waiting, patient and open. But Tom never reached it. Halfway across the frozen field, the ground itself shifted, a low groan beneath the crust of ice, and something rose up through the earth, not with force, but with the slow inevitability of roots breaking soil. He did not cry out as it closed around his ankles, his waist, his chest. Only sighed once, the frost blooming in his beard as his body was drawn down into the white. By morning, only a shallow, cradle-shaped hollow remained, filled with snow so fresh it seemed laid by careful hands. By the next dawn, every man, woman, and child in the village understood without speaking that the walls no longer offered protection. Word of Tom Calder's disappearance spread not through shouts or town meetings, but through the silence that settled in the streets, a silence broken only by the faint groan of the wind carrying the orchard's breath into every doorway. They began to find small signs in their own homes, clumps of blackened roots coiled in the corners of cellars, damp crescents of earth pressed into the floorboards beneath cradles long empty, the lingering scent of sour milk even in rooms with no food. Some boarded windows, others burned herbs, and a few whispered old prayers not heard in Essex County for generations. Yet nothing slowed the pull. The presence had grown bold, its rhythm threading through the beat of their own hearts, matching step for step, breath for breath, until sleep itself became dangerous. More than one family woke to find a loved one gone from their bed in the middle of the night, their footprints leading straight toward the hill before vanishing entirely, swallowed by untouched snow. The constable spoke once of gathering the remaining able men to burn the orchard, but the words left him trembling, his voice fraying to a whisper before he could finish, as though something pressed invisible fingers around his throat, reminding him that the orchard was not just a place, but a mouth that had already tasted too deeply of them to let go. It was desperation, not courage, that drove 6 of them up the hill that night, armed with oil, axes, and the kind of brittle resolve that shatters at the first true test. The moon was a thin, sickle-shaped wound in the sky, and the orchard waited beneath it, its ring of blackened trunks leaning inward as if to shield whatever lay at the center. The snow did not crunch under their boots. It yielded, damp and warm, as though they were walking over flesh rather than frozen ground. When they reached the first tree, the air changed, thickening with a scent that turned their stomachs, sweet, rancid, and metallic all at once, the breath of something that had been buried too long. They poured oil along the bases of the trunks, their hands shaking as they struck matches, but the flames refused to take, each spark winking out the moment it touched the bark, as if swallowed. Then came the sound, low and steady, rising from the hollow at the orchard center, the slow, deliberate heartbeat of the deep thing beneath, vibrating through their bones. One of the men dropped his axe and stepped forward without a word, his body moving in time with the pulse, his eyes glassy and unfocused. The others shouted, grabbing his arms, but the ground surged beneath them, roots tearing upward like skeletal fingers to coil around their legs. The oil can tipped, spilling into the snow, and in the moment before the lantern fell and went dark, they saw that the hollow was no longer empty. It was opening. Only 3 of the 6 came back, and even then, the word back felt wrong because something in their eyes had stayed in the orchard. They stumbled into the village just before dawn, clothes soaked to the waist in a dark, brackish water that steamed in the cold, their skin mottled with strange pale streaks, as if something had gripped them too tightly. When asked what had happened, none could give a full account. One muttered about roots that moved like veins, another kept whispering a lullaby with no words, and the third, the constable himself, had bitten through his tongue at some point in the night, so that every attempt to speak came out as a wet, bubbling rasp. They could not say where the other three had gone, though the black soil under their fingernails told the truth. Dragged down, buried warm. The villagers who dared help them strip off their wet coats swore that the fabric was flecked with tiny fragments of wood that pulsed faintly, as if still alive. By midday, all three survivors had locked themselves in their homes, refusing food or fire, and by the next morning their beds were empty, the doors hanging open, snow blown in to cover floors that showed no footprints leading out. The orchard had not just defended itself, it had called them back to finish what it had begun. By the first thaw, the orchard's reach had begun to seep past the boundaries of the village, carried not by root or soil alone, but by the minds of those it had already touched. Travelers passing along the old post road spoke of a strange heaviness that settled on their chests as they neared the ridge, a slow, measured rhythm that seemed to echo their own heartbeats until they were no longer sure which was theirs. Farmers in the neighboring valley found shallow hollows forming overnight in their fields, each one the size and shape of an infant's cradle, the earth inside damp and warm, even after frost. In the next parish over, a mother was discovered standing barefoot in the snow at dawn, cradling nothing in her arms, her lips moving in the shape of a song she could not hear. When her husband tried to lead her inside, she fought with a strength that broke his wrist, eyes fixed on a direction that pointed unerringly toward the orchard's hill. Letters sent to the county seat asking for aid went unanswered, though one torn envelope was found weeks later nailed to the church door, its contents a single scrap of paper bearing a thumbprint the color of dried blood. By then, the older villagers understood the truth. No one dared speak aloud, that the orchard was no longer just a place, but a hunger that had learned how to walk. In the end, it was not bravery, but exhaustion that brought the last of them together in the cold shadow of the church, their faces drawn and hollow, eyes ringed with the sleepless gray of people who had stopped expecting rescue. A dozen remained, each carrying whatever they could pass off as a weapon: rusted scythes, fire hooks, a jug of lamp oil that sloshed like a heartbeat in glass. They spoke little, for every sound seemed to travel too far in the still air, as though the orchard itself were leaning closer to listen. The plan, if it could be called that, was simple. Wait until the moon was highest, then march to the hill and burn everything, even if it meant digging through the frozen earth to reach whatever beat in the hollow's chest. Yet as they stood in the snow, breath clouding in the dark, they began to hear it, the faint, deliberate creak of wood shifting in the distance, followed by a sound too soft to be wind, too steady to be chance. The lullaby, slow and circling, carried on no lips, wrapping around them until their own hands loosened on their tools. One by one, heads turned toward the ridge without a word, as though the choice had already been made for them. And before any could recall the plan, their feet were moving in the same slow, unbroken cadence, carrying them up the hill toward the orchard's open mouth. The snow in the orchard did not crunch beneath their boots. It sighed, sinking under their weight, as though welcoming them home, and the blackened trunks leaned in to form a cathedral of twisted limbs that blocked the moonlight. At the hollow's center, the ground had split open into a dark, wet mouth, pulsing with that same slow heartbeat they had felt for weeks, each throb releasing a faint breath of heat that smelled of milk soured in the sun. No one spoke, no one resisted, as if their will had been peeled away layer by layer until only obedience remained. One man stepped forward and vanished into the black without a sound, then another, then two at once, the earth closing over each as if swallowing drops of rain. Those who remained swayed in place, their eyes reflecting a dull, unnatural light rising from below, a glow that revealed the truth in brief flashes, root and bone entwined, cradles grown from living wood, and in each cradle something shifting just beneath a membrane of soil. When the last of them stepped into the hollow, the orchard exhaled and the trunks straightened, the snow smoothing itself over until there was no trace of any opening at all. By morning, the hill was still, silent and whole again, waiting with the patience of things that do not measure time in years, but in the number of heartbeats until the next arrival.